Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Lisa Marshall, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, Managing Customer Loyalty. During today's webinar, you'll learn how to take the Net Promoter Score to the next level, move beyond a simple loyal metric, and use this to develop a process to proactively manage customer loyalty and create advocates for your business. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Remember to keep your phones on mute throughout the presentation. This ensures that all attendees can hear the full presentation. We want to ensure that we have time to answer any questions that are raised by today's audience, so we'll be keeping today's presentation to 30 to 40 minutes. At any point during the presentation, you can type questions into the chat box. If you're in full screen mode, mouse over the top of the screen to access the Q&A box. And if you're not in full screen mode, you'll see the chat box on the right side of your screen. Our presenter today is John Barrett. John has nearly 25 years of experience in market research and strategic planning and is, as we like to say, ABD, all but desertated, for a PhD in marketing from the University of Virginia. Expertise includes customer satisfaction, strategic market analysis, strategic planning, competitor analysis, and mergers and acquisitions. John's an original founder of PMG and serves as the company's president. John has been on your side of the desk as well as a consultant, and so he understands the day-to-day stresses that you deal with and can offer real-time consulting assistance. Just a little bit about PMG. Our mission is to help clients identify and capture profitable growth opportunities, and our work builds upon our experience, but we customize for each client and each project. Founded in 1993, we initially focused on customer satisfaction. We've moved into B2B research, and we operate in all B2B markets. All partners come from corporate marketing and strategy background. We work globally, and our client list includes Fortune 500 clients. Partial list of our clients, just to give you a feel for the depth of our work. And so if you haven't already, please mute your phone. And with that, John, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. And for everyone who has joined us, thank you for taking time out of your schedule this afternoon. And we look forward to spending a little bit of time here together to talk about the Net Promoter Score. We're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about kind of the background, some definitions, and where we see some potential limitations with using the Net Promoter Score, or NPS, and then get into what really is kind of the meat of the presentation, is how to make it more actionable. And we'll talk about why there are some limitations on its actionability in the theoretical current form. And then we'll open it up for some questions. And as Lisa said, we think we can cover all of this information in about 35 minutes or so. So let's start with kind of the background. Net Promoter Score, NPS, was introduced by a consultant in a 2003 HBR article. And it was designed to be really the one number, and in fact, that was the title of the article, One Number You Need to Grow. They measured customer relationship or experience and was intended to be a way to predict business growth. So in other words, if a business scored high on NPS, there's a higher likelihood of growth. It is, in fact, a key measure of a company's overall strength with their customers, particularly relative to their brand. And it is a proven leading indicator of growth. And so there's no question that NPS is an anchor for what's come to be called, even since this article was released, customer experience management. And that is a concept that is growing, really moving from the consumer side of the world to the B2B side of the world. And so NPS is really a complement to other metrics such as customer satisfaction, loyalty, profitability, repeat business, et cetera, that track and monitor and predict customer behavior and future performance. So what is the Net Promoter Score? It is a response to a question: how likely is it that you would recommend this company, and usually that's named specifically, so how likely is it that you would recommend ABC to a friend or colleague? And it's done on, the responses are on a 10-point scale, where a 9 or 10 is indicative of what is called a promoter. That is, a customer that is loyal to the point that they essentially have no or very little hesitation about giving an extremely high score in terms of their likelihood of recommending. The next tier down is those who would rate a 7 or 8, and the idea here is that these are more passive in terms of their willingness or ability to recommend the company. There's something going on. They cannot rate at the highest level of a 9 or 10. There's some hesitation, there's some issue. So they're satisfied, but probably not what we'd call an enthusiastic customer. And so they are somewhat vulnerable to competitive products or services that they may be offered. And then anything below a 7, from a 6 all the way down to a 0, these are customers who are actually so unhappy or so dissatisfied that there is a reasonably high risk of them actually damaging the brand or damaging the reputation and limiting or impeding growth through their negative word of mouth. And so the actual measurement of the Net Promoter Score is the percentage of promoters that are included in the measurement minus the percentage of detractors. So in our little example here, let's say we did a study and we asked the question, how likely is it that you would recommend this company to a friend or colleague? 52% rated a 9 or 10, 28% rated a 7 or 8, and 20% rated below a 7, a 6 down to 0. So the Net Promoter Score is simply that 52, the percentage of promoters, minus the 20, the percentage of detractors, or 32%. So the NPS is a percentage score. And once you see this, you can tie this back to the logic of the name. It is a promoter score, but it's netted out, the net being out of detractors. So the net promoters that are existing in the marketplace. So this is a measure of loyalty. It's the percentage of people that are in a position where they would promote you, net of those who would detract from your position. So what are the benefits here? Well, the single biggest benefit is that this is a very simple concept, and it's a single question. And if you recall, that was the original title of the article, the one question that you need to track. It's recognized by many in industry, both in consumer and B2B, as a strong, viable metric. It is, in fact, a good measure of customer loyalty. You can see, the intent is a future intent. It's how likely will you be. It's not what you have done, but it's a future intent. How likely will you be to perform some type of action? And then the other thing that makes this particularly attractive and is a strong benefit for using NPS is the fact that there is a growing normative database that's available. So in other words, if you are in any particular industry, there is a reasonable chance that there is a norm on NPS against which you can compare your NPS score. So if you're in insurance, for example, you can compare your NPS score to other insurance companies and see how you fare. If you are a capital goods manufacturer, the same thing. If you're in the freight business, et cetera. On the other side of the ledger here, the limitations, there really is no direction or really even facility for looking at improvement priorities. In other words, we know how likely people are to recommend us, but we don't know why they would recommend us. We don't know why they might be hesitant to recommend us, and we don't know anything we can do to improve that position, or even if it can be improved. A second limitation is there's no competitive information. We know how people feel about recommending us, but they may be equally as strong or even stronger in terms of their willingness to recommend a competitor. We don't know. There is limited analysis that can be done here. It's really restricted to looking at how we perform year over year or period over period. So we can track NPS over time, and we can see our score go from a 36 in our example to maybe a 40 or down to a 32. And so we can track that over time, and that gives us some indication of our relative loyalty performance. But we also really have no indication of the magnitude of that increase. So if we increase from a 36 to a 40, we really don't know if that's a good or modest or really unacceptable level of increase. Another limitation is it's really not actionable. This ties back to the lack of improvement opportunities. So when we get a score of, let's say, a 36, there's no prescription on that as to what do we do next. How do we move that higher, and what are the benefits, the financial benefits of moving higher? And so lastly, kind of in summary, we really can't tie it to retention or growth. We don't know how to link this back to anything substantive. We do know that it has strong implications for loyalty because we're really asking intended behavior, but we can't statistically or empirically tie that back to a financial or other customer performance measure. Now, NPS is very widely used. If you look at on the top chart here, the flattened globe, if we look at total NPS results that have been compiled since the 2003 Reichhold article, roughly equal percentages are coming from the Western Hemisphere, USA and LATAM, as from the EMEA region, and then a smaller percentage, about a third of those two regions in the Asia-Pacific region. And obviously, there's many who believe that the Asia-Pacific region will grow in its use of NPS as the word continues to spread. On the bottom left is a chart showing the usage of NPS by business to consumer, or B2C, compared to business to business, B2B, and it's roughly half and half. That was not the case when it began. It began more as a B2C tool and has migrated or grown in popularity on the B2B side. And then the bottom right chart is showing the same type of information as in the global chart, as just the usage of NPS by size of company. And you can see while there is a slight increase in usage among very large companies, it really is used across the board. So the point of this slide is that NPS is very widely used, almost no matter how we look at the distribution of results. However, the results are what we would call questionable, really. So if we look at our example here on the top, let's say we had a Net Promoter Score of 34, and that could be derived by the calculation that we have here. We've got 640 responses, and out of those responses, 17% were detractors. Recall that's the 0 to 6 rating. 51% were promoters, that is the 9 and 10 rating, and 32% were in the middle, that passive 7 and 8 rating. And so there's our score. 51 minus 17 is 34. But so we look at the 34 NPS, and that's the kind of the own program NPS. So that we know that's the Net Promoter Score. But there's another 49% that are not promoters. And the reasons here is we've got poor understanding of goals for the company. There's really no strategic changes that have been initiated as a result of NPS. There's a lack of management buy-in because there is no actionable information. And we can't link NPS directly to retention. And so we've got to find some way to take that 34, or whatever our NPS score is, and tie that back into something meaningful, something actionable that we can really pursue here, as opposed to just looking at the non-promoters and understanding that, like in our example here, we basically got, half promoters, but we got half non-promoters. And so it leaves us in a position of, what do we do? How do we respond? What action do we take? Right now, if we just look at the NPS as that one question type of measurement, we really are limited to what we can do. We've talked about the year-over-year improvement, and on the right is an example of that kind of a chart where we're looking at changes in NPS for various types of software. You can see some of the names there that you might be familiar with: McAfee, Intuit, Symantec, et cetera. On the left is a chart of benchmarking. Again, this is using NPS. And so we can take any one of these variables and look at low and high NPS for auto dealers, for software, for et cetera, all the way down these different industries, and look at the average NPS in red or the lower high NPS for that particular industry. And so whenever we do a measurement, let's say we're an automobile dealer, we know that NPS is probably going to range between, 30 and 60. And so we come back with a 50 and we say, okay, we're about midpoint. Useful, helpful, insightful information, but again, not actionable. So that's a little background on what Net Promoter Score is and what are the limitations. So what we'd like to do now, where we'd really like to spend a little bit more time in the few minutes we have this afternoon, is understanding how do we make that more actionable? How do we take this great idea, this Net Promoter Score concept, which we know impacts loyalty, and how do we make it more actionable? And so we've got some suggestions here on how to do that. One would be to start with including competition in our measurement of what's taking place in the marketplace. So here's a way to do that. Let's say we're Alpha Company. We can ask about Alpha Company's performance on a variety of attributes. In this case, just an example, we're showing the category of deliveries and shipments. And so we've got some sub-attributes there, things like accuracy and minimum order size and on-time deliveries, order lead times. And so we're looking for ratings of Alpha Company's performance on the left-hand scale there from 1 to 7, and then the best alternate supplier on the right-hand scale, again from 1 to 7. And so on any one of these attributes, we're going to get a measure of both companies, both Alpha Company and the best alternate. As we gain that rating, we're gaining information about the relative position of Alpha Company as well. So as an example, let's say Alpha Company is rated a 6 on accuracy and the best alternate is rated a 5. And we know that for that customer, Alpha Company is performing at a higher level than the best alternate. That may vary across the different attributes, so it may be the same, maybe higher, maybe lower. We can combine that information across respondents, and now we get a picture of Alpha Company's performance versus the best alternate supplier. We can also look at importance by attribute. So here is now we've expanded just from deliveries or shipments in the center section of this chart, the minimum order size, on-time deliveries, et cetera, accuracy of shipments, to a whole range of attributes that include product performance, product development, deliveries, sales and customer support, technical support, price and value, and then overall value on the far right. And what we're looking at here is the results of an analysis of the R-square, or the correlation between any one attribute and overall satisfaction, which is not included on this chart. The R-square calculation will range from a 0 to a 1 being a perfect or lockstep correlation. So we see some attributes here like product line, or I'm sorry, water repellency on the right-hand side there, the 0.02, and dimensional stability, the third one from the left, and moving over a little right of center there, the ease of placing an order at 0.09. All of those attributes have very little impact on overall performance, overall satisfaction. However, things like value, the creative capability, or really the product innovation, the minimum order size, complaint handling, really the whole category of technical support, and price responsiveness. All of those attributes have a strong impact on overall satisfaction. So in other words, we can make an order easier to place, we can improve the water repellency or dimensional stability of the product, and it's going to have limited impact on our customer satisfaction. But if we increase the perceived creative capability that we offer, if we decrease the minimum order size, if we perform better on complaint handling, if we provide better technical support, those kinds of changes will have substantial impact on overall satisfaction. And so we can put those two findings, the performance and importance, together in a chart such as this, and look for those areas where there might be, for example, in the lower right quadrant of this matrix, relatively high performance, in this case above a 6, and low importance. So those are areas that we would call table stakes. So in other words, customers are not expecting big improvements there. These are not areas of particular importance to them in their determination of satisfaction with Acme Company as a supplier. And so these are some areas where the company might want to make considered investments, but probably be more interested in retaining current levels of performance. On the opposite corner of this matrix are those attributes where the relative score is lower, we're below the average score, and the importance is very high. So something like creative capability or the overall value, what customers are telling us is that those things are very, very important in terms of driving overall satisfaction, and the relative performance there is somewhat weak. So we want to do what we can to shift that performance. So this kind of an analysis helps us to zero in on those handful of attributes, particularly those ones in the upper left-hand quadrant, where there is substantial opportunity for improvement. Now, you may be asking, okay, I'm not seeing Net Promoter Score in this yet. How does that tie in? And we're just about to get there. So we have looked at performance, but now we can also look at performance versus competition. Here we're showing a chart of performance versus the best alternate supplier. The blue bars to the right are where we're ahead of competition. The red bars to the left where Alpha is behind competition. And so it gives us an understanding of the relative position of the company versus this theoretical best alternate supplier. But now we can also ask our customers, who is that best alternate supplier? So as we gather this information, we can also then break it out from the aggregate kind of composite theoretical best alternate supplier down to the component companies, in this case Beta, to understand how is the company really performing versus a specific competitor. So we now have a head-to-head profile of performance versus a specific competitive company. And so we can see how we're performing in terms of product quality, innovation, sales representation, et cetera, and even down to the sub-attribute level, things like our roll formation or the film appearance. Okay, now here's where it starts to get interesting, and here's where we can tie in loyalty. So that same information, that competitive position, if we look on the left-hand chart, that is essentially our same chart that we just looked at versus the best alternate supplier, but now we have ordered those attributes based on the importance in terms of driving Net Promoter Score. So those attributes that are circled there and then kind of drawn out and highlighted on the right-hand side of this chart, global market knowledge, local presence, meeting quality needs, on-time deliveries, et cetera, those are the 7 attributes that are driving Net Promoter Score. Another way to say that is those attributes drive customer loyalty. So we can determine that very easily using the same kind of an R-square calculation. In fact, when we have done this type of work, and we've done many, many studies like this, we typically find that over 90% of the loyalty factor is described by these top 5 plus or minus attributes. Maybe 7 is in this case, maybe as few as 3, but they describe or define or account for over 90% of the variance in loyalty. So, you know, while some companies are looking for, you know, how do we improve our loyalty without any effort, or trying to minimize our effort, what we believe that we can offer with this kind of approach is a very simple, methodical, logical way to move from asking customers about their loyalty through the Net Promoter Score, but then tying that in to importance and to competitive position to give us specific and actionable kinds of outcomes. So here's what we mean by that. If we look at the chart that we were looking at just a few minutes ago on comparing performance on the horizontal axis and importance on the vertical axis, you recall that we had identified creative capability and overall value as those attributes that were the kind of the prime candidates for improvement, or what we call improvement priorities. So we can break those out, and let's look at creative capability, for example. Well, how can creative capability be improved? Well, when we look back at the comments that came from the survey, so verbatims, or the voice of the customer that we captured as part of this survey, there are 4 key things that came out of that. One is to do an inventory of current capabilities. What is Alpha currently doing in terms of driving creativity in product development? We also want to review complaints and identify where is the company deficient. And then there are several customers as a part of this process that identified specific needs that they have. Well, we can go back to those customers and really understand what is it that you need, and how can we begin to address those needs in a targeted fashion. And then create a process improvement or continuous improvement team to go after some of those improvements. Well, let's just take another example. One of the other factors that came up in that kind of upper quadrant was the timeliness of response. And again, if we look back not only at the quantitative measures, but also the qualitative data that we got through the verbatims, the voice of the customer, there are several specific steps that became clear here. One is that we need to create a method to measure performance in customer service. So how do we measure that? And some specific things that came out of that were like timeliness of response, availability or accessibility of the customer service rep. Those things can be measured and tracked through an SAP or other type of system pretty easily. And so then once we know that, we can initiate a minimum response time in customer service, very similar to what you might see at a QSR restaurant, where there are guidelines about how quickly a drive-through customer is served, same kind of idea. And so then actually build that response time in as part of the sales bonus structure. So that CSR, the sales rep, everybody who's involved with that account relationship has money on the line, if you will, in terms of how well that order center or the customer service rep performs. I think that gives you an idea there. Well, let's go a step further and look at how we might do that relative to the loyalty indicator. So as we saw, we've got 7, I believe, attributes that came up in terms of our loyalty drivers. So these 7 are accounting for 90% plus of what we see as variance in loyalty. Another way to say that is these are the 7 things that will drive loyalty. We don't even need to worry about the other 20 attributes. Don't even get them on the radar screen. If we fix these, we're fixing 90% of the problem. We know we're already ahead on global market knowledge and local presence. We know our big weakness is in order lead times. So again, another way to say this is because of our competitive weakness on order lead times, there are people in the marketplace, in fact, our own customers, that are out there saying, I'm not sure if I could recommend Alpha as you know, my best supplier. Well, we got to fix that situation. So how do we do that? Well, one is we identify those problem customers. So who are the ones where we are having an issue? I don't mean a problem customer, I mean where we're having problems. We need to review our lead time policies. How are we setting lead times when that order first comes in? Is that being set in a way that is fair and equitable both to the customer and to our manufacturing processes? Then we need to look at promise dates versus delivery dates. Are we promising something that might be unreasonable and putting ourselves in a difficult situation? Or, in fact, are we doing the opposite? Are we giving ourselves too much room in that promise date, and so customers don't believe our order lead times? We've got to really understand what's going on behind that. Once we understand these key issues, then we can sensibly and feasibly develop a 100% on-time delivery process. Until we really know what on-time delivery is, until we know how customers evaluate that, and until we know where the pitfalls in our processes are, there's no value. In fact, there's negative value in trying to implement any type of performance-driven type of process. We can do the same thing with meeting quality needs. Review the history, drive that all the way through to using TQM or continuous improvement kind of process to really drive capability to meet those specifications. So what we're talking about is really actionable insights that can be really translated to implementation plans which are aligned, and that's a key word there. It's not just implementing something, but it's implementing something that is aligned with processes, with MBOs, with incentive structures, with review policies, et cetera. So then we're really assuring success. Unlike this poor set of workers here that only know the customers hate us, and the good news is they have a lot fewer customers than they used to. Okay, so we've kind of moved through this at a reasonably rapid pace, and we'd like to take just a couple of questions now, and one that I saw come in, I'll go ahead and jump in this, and I think then Lisa will come back with a couple that she's picked up during the presentation. One that I saw come in was, if the Net Promoter Score has limitations, such as what you've outlined here, then why is it so popular? And, good question, good observation. And as we noted, it is popular. It's being used across various sizes of companies. It's being used across industries, as we saw in the benchmarking chart, and it's being used around the world. And we believe the main reason why NPS is so popular is because it's very, very easy. At Priority Metrics, we have had some clients that are, let's say, enamored with or use the Net Promoter Score as a single question and like it very much because it's a single question. They don't have to design a long survey, don't have to bother their customers with anything more than one question. They can get quick feedback, and it gives them an indication of their performance. And all of that is exactly correct. Our issue, again, as we've outlined in this presentation, is that it's limited in terms of response. That's the big issue. You really can't do anything in an empirical kind of way to improve Net Promoter Score. You have no data on which to do that. But it remains and probably will continue to be a very popular measure. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa. Lisa, I think you might have a couple of other questions that have come in.
I do have a couple of other quick questions, John. How often would you recommend conducting an NPS survey?
Yeah, good question. Like most surveys, the frequency really depends on a number of factors. One of the largest, I think, in our opinion, our estimation, would be the impact on customers. Customers are a business's most valuable asset, and so we want to get good information from them, but we don't want to tax them unnecessarily with what they might perceive as a burden. And even if we're talking about a handful of questions, again, we'd obviously recommend more than one, But even if we're talking about 8 or 10 questions, we still want to be very careful with the frequency with which we do that. The other factor that I think plays into this is the kind of the dynamics of the industry. How quickly is that industry changing? And so you might have some industries, for example, that are under, they're facing regulatory changes. Industries that are seeing, technology impact how business is conducted. Industries that are dealing with rapid product innovation. And so in those types of environments, you may want to really survey on almost a continuous basis. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. That would be on one end of the spectrum. On the other end would be some industries that are fairly conservative, that have not been subject to consistent or regular change. And so in those types of industries where change is less frequent, where the customer relationships tend to be fairly understood, and also where the goods might not be purchased as frequently. And so the opportunities for interaction between the vendor or manufacturer and the customer are less frequent. That is going to be there's going to be less frequent need for an understanding of loyalty or satisfaction or value. And so on the one end, if it's going to be done continuously, what we would recommend is dividing the customer list up into some unit of a multiple of 12. Maybe it's 12, 24, 6, whatever it might be. And surveying that section or that wedge of the total customer base on an annually driven kind of basis, maybe monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, et cetera. On the other end of the spectrum, about the farthest that I would want to wait to get information back from customers would probably be about once every 3 years. So somewhere between those, again, based on the dynamics of the industry, based on the size of the customer base, based on the, all these other factors that we identified. So that would be our recommendation.
All right, another question, John. Is there a percentage of respondents that you target for an NPS or for a survey?
Yeah, another good question, and that raises a couple of points that we really don't have time to get into in a kind of a full way this afternoon. One is, what is a good response rate? And then kind of the corollary to that is, how do you deal with non-response bias? So let's start with the first one, what is a good response rate? And response rate in general, kind of the rule of thumb is that you need a higher response rate if you have a lower population or a lower customer base. So if you've got a customer base of, let's say, 100 individuals, that may be 50 companies, but 100 individuals. So when we talk about a customer base, we're talking about the individuals that can influence a customer purchase decision. So if, just to make the discussion a little easier, let's say that's 100 individuals. With those 100 individuals, we probably need to get a response rate north of 50%. Okay, so I would even shoot for 60 or 70%. As that population or the size of the customer base increases, the response rate necessary to get good results decreases. So as we move to, like, let's say 1,000 contacts, individuals in a customer base, we really only need to get about 150 responses. As we move up to 10,000 customer contacts, we only need to get about 200 responses. If we went the other way from 100 and we went down to, let's say, 30 or 40 customer contacts, we'd need to increase our response rate probably, let's say with 30 contacts, we really need to get probably 20 to 25 responses to have reasonable confidence. And that leads us to the second part of the answer, is the non-response bias. And that simply is looking for the possibility that people who did not respond to our survey differed in some systematic way from those who did respond. So let's just take kind of a popular example just to make the concept a little easier. Let's say we're trying to determine, who's going to win the next election. Is it going to be, Trump or Clinton? Well, if we get a sample of, let's say, 250 registered voters in the U.S., from a statistical standpoint, that is enough to answer that question with a high degree of statistical precision. That's just a fact, if it's a random sample. The problem is we may not know if it's random. So if that sample tended to skew towards those individuals that would be more likely to be Trump voters or Clinton voters, then we might get a skewed result. And that is because those that are included in the sample differ in some systematic way from those that are excluded from the sample. That's the non-response bias problem. There really is no good way to prevent non-response bias other than doing our best to ensure that we have given everyone an opportunity to respond, that there's nothing that restricts anyone from responding, and we're treating all responses from a statistical standpoint. We're trying to get all responses in that we possibly can. Now, in the B2B world, the other issue is that, quite frankly, all responses are not equal. The key decision maker at a company's largest customer is obviously going to carry more weight than someone who just walks in off the street and buys once in a lifetime. And so unlike the consumer world where basically all customers are created equally, one might buy, let's say, 1 tube of crust a year, another one might buy 3, but none of them are going to influence, the producer of that product to any great degree. That's not true in the B2B world. So there is a lot of both science and art that comes into designing a sample and designing a survey so that we can get maximum response and we minimize that non-response problem. But again, in general, in terms of how many responses do you need, you can use that rule of thumb. If you got about 100 contacts, you want at least 50. As you go up from there, you'll never need more than about 200, even if your customer base is everyone in the world.
All right. Well, John, thank you for that additional input into the topic. That was my last question that had come in from the audience. So unless we have some others out there, we'll hold just a moment. Yeah, I think things are quiet. So if you do have questions or something else that you'd like to cover with us following the presentation, please feel free to reach out to John or any of us. We'd love to answer any other questions or discuss our processes in more detail. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to discussing your next question with you.